Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I joined a dark web group that knew about a new virus before the news broke. Now they want me to help spread it. Alright, so here's the deal. I've always had a thing for digging into places I shouldn't. It started out simple, just curiosity, like exploring urban legends and lurking in weird subreddits, that kind of thing. But recently, my curiosity took me to a darker place, literally. A couple of months ago, I started browsing the deep web, not the scary stuff, but just trying to see what's out there. You'd be surprised at the things people are willing to put on there. And honestly, 90% of it's pretty boring, like forums on conspiracy theories and old message boards. But then, I stumbled onto something I still regret. There was this invite-only chat room called the Incubation Hub. It was tucked away in a list on some random shady website that was dedicated to experiments. The description was vague, but it mentioned discussions on global health and biological phenomena. I figured it was probably a group of scientists, or maybe even just a bunch of nerds, talking about their conspiracy theories. Still, it piqued my interest, so I decided to try getting in. I didn't think it would work, but to my surprise, after filling out some random survey, I got an email link a few hours later. Once I was in, I realized it wasn't exactly what I expected. It was quiet, first of all. Just a few people were online, and they had these weird, clinical-sounding usernames like Dr. Suture and Viral Vector. All the discussions were locked down except for this one welcome thread. So, I posted a quick introduction, something simple like, "Hey, I'm interested in learning about global health." I guess. I didn't even know what to say. But about an hour later, I got a private message. The user's name was Host0. There was no profile pic or info, just this message. "Welcome. You were invited here because of your interest in virology. Here we discuss new developments and exchange samples. We do not permit discussions outside of our group." The wording was odd. Exchange samples? I had no background in virology, but I played along. I just wanted to see where it went, So I asked, "Cool, so what kind of samples are we talking about?" Host0 replied, almost immediately. "We are monitoring the evolution of respiratory infections. You will be introduced to our findings soon." I don't know why, but something about the way they phrased it sent a chill down my spine. There was a clinical detachment in every word. I got this vibe that they were talking about something real, something they weren't supposed to have access to. Still, I couldn't back out just yet. Curiosity had its claws in me. Besides, I was still convinced that this was some elaborate roleplay group or just a bunch of science-obsessed weirdos. But that assumption didn't last long. A few days later, I got a notification from the group. They had posted an update in the main forum. The title was E472, Southeast Asia variant. No one had commented, but there were already hundreds of views. My first thought was, is this a prank? E472 sounded like some random code. I clicked on the post, expecting some kind of meme or inside joke, but it wasn't a joke at all. There were files attached, documents, lab reports, and medical images. They looked authentic, detailed with data on infection rates and a couple of scans of what I assumed were infected lungs. The thing that got to me the most was this small, grainy video clip embedded at the bottom of the post. It showed a person, male, I think, though it was hard to tell with how gaunt he looked. He was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to a bunch of machines, his chest heaving like he was fighting for every single breath. The caption underneath the video said, 72 hours post-infection. Now, I'll admit, I was freaked out, but a small part of me was still convinced this was all fake. Maybe some kind of dark web horror story project. I'd heard of groups making weird, creepy ARGs, so I thought maybe this was one of those. But I couldn't shake this nagging feeling, something telling me this was different. After I watched the video, I got another message from host Zero. Please confirm you viewed the materials. We expect a response from all members. At this point, it felt like I was in too deep. I had no idea how serious these people were, but I didn't want to piss them off. So I typed back, yeah, I saw it. Is this real? I didn't get an immediate reply. Instead, the whole forum just went dark. Every thread was locked down, and my messages went unread. For about 2 days, there was complete silence. I almost forgot about it, honestly. Tried to brush it off as a freaky prank. But then I got another message, just as cold and clinical as the last one. You will be receiving further instructions. Prepare to assist with distribution. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it wasn't good. I didn't sleep much after that last message. Prepare to assist with distribution. What did that even mean? Was this all a twisted game? Or were they genuinely planning something? Every time I tried to dismiss it as some sick joke, my mind went back to that video. The image of that man gasping for breath, his chest rising and falling so unnaturally, was burned into my brain. And that file, A472, it sounded clinical, official, too official. Then, just when I was ready to block everything and forget I ever saw any of it, I got another message from host Zero. Only this time, the message wasn't some ominous instruction. It was a list of addresses, 5 of them, scattered around the city, and none of them familiar. Below the list, a simple line. Pick up your delivery from the drop-off point closest to you. It felt like my heart stopped. This wasn't just about watching files or clicking on shady links. They were telling me to go somewhere, to pick up something. I knew I should have ignored it, but some sick curiosity in me took over. Maybe I just needed to know if this was real, or some elaborate prank that would end with me standing in front of an empty warehouse, or finding a bag of fake, harmless materials. I convinced myself that if I went, I could prove it was all fake and be done with it. So, I picked the drop-off point closest to me. It was in a part of town I'd never been to, this dingy little alleyway behind a row of abandoned shops. When I got there, I almost turned back. The place reeked of garbage and something stole, like mildew mixed with rot. There was an old metal mailbox bolted to a crumbling brick wall, rusted and barely hanging on. I figured that had to be the drop. Inside, there was a small brown box, sealed with plain packing tape. No labels, no markings, just a blank, ordinary-looking box. For a second, I felt a wave of relief. This could all still be some twisted joke. I was half expecting a note inside that would say, "You've been pranked," or some other stupid, edgy message. But when I opened it, all that relief evaporated. Inside the box was a small glass vial, filled with a cloudy, yellowish liquid, wrapped in a thin layer of bubble wrap. And next to it, a small black USB drive. My hand started shaking as I pulled the vial out, careful not to spill or even jostle it too much. I didn't know what was in there, but something in my gut told me it was nothing I wanted to be around. The liquid was thick, almost like mucus, and there was this faint, sour smell that escaped the cap, even though it was sealed tight. I felt like I was holding something toxic, something that shouldn't be outside of a lab. That's when I noticed there was a piece of paper tucked at the bottom of the box. I unfolded it, feeling more nervous with each word I read. Welcome to Phase 1. This sample is part of an experiment to monitor the effects of transmission. You are expected to distribute as instructed. That was it. No other instructions, no explanation, just distribute as instructed. And at the bottom of the note, there was a line in bold text that made my stomach drop. Failure to comply will result in immediate consequences. I stared at the note, my mind racing. What the hell did immediate consequences even mean? Did they know who I was, where I lived? I was starting to feel like I'd walked into some kind of nightmare. Part of me wanted to throw the vial as far away from me as possible, smash it against the wall, and run. But the other part, the paranoid part, felt like they were watching me somehow, like they'd know if I disobeyed. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket as I walked back to my car. I don't even remember the drive home. I was on autopilot, too freaked out to think straight. As soon as I got back, I plugged the drive into my laptop, half hoping it would be empty or corrupted. But no, it opened right up, and what I found was a set of files with instructions on transmission methods. There were diagrams, notes on air dispersal, surface transfer, and even water contamination. It looked like it had been ripped straight out of some high-level research document, but there was no logo, no institution, nothing to trace it back to anyone. Just these sterile, matter-of-fact instructions, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Then I noticed a folder at the bottom labeled Participants. My hands felt clammy as I opened it, dreading what I might find. Inside was a list of names, photos, and descriptions. Every person on that list looked normal, just everyday people. Some were older, some were teenagers, but they all had one thing in common. Their status was marked as active. They all had dates next to their names too, dates that matched up with posts in the forum. The worst part? Some of the names had a note next to them that said, "Sample delivered." And that's when I saw my name, right at the bottom of the list. Inactive, sample awaiting distribution. I sat there, staring at my own name on that list, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Inactive, sample awaiting distribution. It was like seeing my own obituary. They didn't have my address, or at least they hadn't shown it. But somehow, they had me. My name, my photo, even a date listed as pending. I knew that going to the police was out of the question. What was I going to say? "Hi, I got a virus sample from a dark web group, and they're telling me to distribute it." I'd sound insane. Or worse, like I was the threat. And who's to say this group didn't have people watching me already? Or connections. If they could find my name, they could find more. My family, my friends. If they were as serious as they seemed, what would they do to them if I didn't comply? Hours passed with me, just staring at my laptop, trying to make sense of everything. Every scenario in my head led to the same twisted choice. Do as they say, or try to disappear completely. The latter felt like a gamble. Would they even let me disappear? I couldn't shake the feeling that running wouldn't work, not with how they seemed to have planned everything out to the smallest detail. The thing that really got me, though, was the others on that list. There were close to 20 people, most of them marked as active with their dates of delivery. There was one entry that was even more recent, a guy named Native91. His sample had been delivered just days before mine was scheduled. It was like a compulsion. I needed to know if this guy was still out there, or if something had happened to him. Maybe he'd ignored their instructions, and I'd find some article about him disappearing, or worse. So, I did what anyone would do. I started digging. After hours of searching through endless social media accounts, I found him. Nate F91 was Nate Fisher, a 32-year-old living just a couple states away. His Facebook and Instagram were still active, full of random posts about his job, his dog, stuff that seemed painfully normal. Nothing seemed off at first, but as I scrolled further, I noticed something weird. His posts just stopped about a week ago, just went dead silent. No posts, no comments, no activity. I found his last post, a selfie of him and his dog, both smiling in that way people do when they don't realize it might be their last good day. But what sent a chill down my spine was a comment under the photo. Someone had asked him, "Where you been, man? You disappeared." His response, "Don't worry, man, just taking care of some stuff. Gotta make a delivery." A delivery. The same word I'd been told in those cryptic messages. It was like I was seeing my future play out in front of me, and it wasn't looking good. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to find a way to get out of this before I wound up like Nate, a ghost with a final cryptic post. But there was another part of me, the paranoid part, that felt like they were waiting for me to make a move, watching even. And the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced they'd know if I didn't do exactly what they told me. A message pinged on the forum. It was from Host Zero. Status update required. Have you distributed the sample? Time is critical. There was no way to delay this. I had to respond, or at least pretend I was cooperating long enough to figure out what to do. My hands were sweating as I typed back, trying to sound like I wasn't scared out of my mind. I have the sample. What am I supposed to do with it? The reply came within seconds. Select a location with maximum exposure potential. Avoid familiar places. Public transit, shopping centers, any high-density area will suffice. They wanted me to take it somewhere crowded. A bus station, a mall, somewhere that would give this thing the most reach. The thought made me feel physically sick. How could I do that? Release. Whatever this was. And to strangers, people just going about their day. People like Nate had been, like I'd been before I got caught up in this nightmare. But they weren't leaving me much choice. A part of me felt like they'd chosen me precisely because I wouldn't want to do it, because I'd hesitate and think too much. That hesitation would make me harder to trace if I decided to spill everything. It made me feel like I was their perfect little puppet. I stared at the vial, wondering what kind of twisted, deranged person even thought to do something like this. And the USB drive with all those methods of dispersal, all the ways to contaminate without being detected. It was all so precise, so calculated. The instructions even included tips for staying anonymous, like wearing inconspicuous clothing and avoiding security cameras. Then my phone buzzed. It was a private number, but something in my gut told me it wasn't a telemarketer or spam. I let it ring for a second, but the buzzing just kept going. relentless, like they wouldn't stop until I picked up. I answered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" A voice, low and clinical, came through. It wasn't Host Zero, at least not that I could tell, but whoever it was had the same detached, cold tone. "Your compliance is mandatory. Any deviation will be monitored. Execute as instructed, or prepare for the consequences." Then they hung up, just like that. I dropped the phone, feeling every hair on my body stand up. I'd felt like I was being watched before, but now I was certain. These people weren't just messing around. They were deadly serious, and they weren't going to let me off the hook. If I didn't do this, if I didn't comply, I had no doubt they'd make good on those consequences. The next day, I took the vial with me, feeling like I was carrying a bomb in my pocket. But as I walked around, searching for a place to distribute it, I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the one to start, whatever this was. Maybe there was still a way out, some way to fool them long enough to get the authorities involved, without making it obvious. Then I saw a camera across the street, aimed directly at me. It was one of those older surveillance cameras on a telephone pole. But in that moment, it felt like it was watching me, judging my every move. The moment I spotted that camera, every nerve in my body went on high alert. The rational part of me knew it was probably just a regular traffic camera watching over a random street corner, but something in my gut told me otherwise. It felt too deliberate, like it had been positioned to catch me at that exact spot. My mind raced, replaying the cold voice from the night before, reminding me that any deviation will be monitored. Were they really watching me? I walked on, trying to act casual, but every step felt heavier, like I was being pulled deeper into something I'd never escape from. People bustled past, just living their lives, completely unaware of the vial in my pocket. They had no idea what I was carrying, the choice I had to make. As I made my way further down the street, I became aware of every little sound, every tiny movement. I swear I could hear footsteps following me, just a half beat behind my own. But every time I turned to check, no one was there. Just strangers going about their day. I felt like I was in some kind of invisible cage, every step drawing me closer to what exactly? My own destruction? Or something far worse? I found myself in the city center, right in front of a crowded train station. It was bustling with people rushing to catch the next train, grabbing coffee, or just chatting, completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in my head. The vial felt heavier in my pocket, like it was burning a hole through my jacket. This was exactly the kind of high-density area they'd instructed me to find. And that's when I realized, if I went through with this, there would be no going back. The vial would break, the infection would spread, and I'd be responsible for whatever came next. I'd be their puppet, doing their bidding, and they'd probably discard me like nothing once I'd served my purpose. My fingers grazed the vial, and in that split second, I had a horrifying thought. What if it didn't stop here? What if they weren't just planning for me to distribute one sample, but expected me to do this again and again? Each sample, each delivery, making me more complicit, dragging me deeper until I was trapped, tied to them by layers of guilt and horror. Maybe that was their endgame, to create an army of ordinary people forced into spreading this infection across cities, towns, even countries. A text buzzed on my phone, breaking me out of my spiraling thoughts. I pulled it out, dreading what I'd see on the screen. It was from Host Zero, and it was just one line, Time is running out. Fail, and you will face consequences. I couldn't ignore it anymore. They were getting impatient. Every part of my body screamed at me to toss the vial into the nearest trash can and run. But just as that thought crossed my mind, I caught a glimpse of a man standing across the street, staring directly at me. He was tall, dressed in a plain black jacket and jeans, blending into the crowd, but his gaze was locked onto mine, unblinking, cold. I felt a chill roll down my spine. He wasn't carrying anything, wasn't trying to hide. He was just watching, and the way he was looking at me, it was as if he knew everything, as if he'd been briefed on my every move. Maybe he was one of them, a real-life agent of this twisted organization, here to make sure I didn't back out. I knew then that there was no easy way out. They'd see any hesitation, and if I didn't do exactly what they'd asked, they'd make sure I paid for it. The man across the street subtly lifted his phone, pointing it at me like he was taking a picture. A warning, a reminder that he could report back if I deviated from their plans. Heart pounding, I slipped my hand into my pocket, feeling the smooth, cold glass of the vial. It was like my hand was moving on its own, like I'd been hypnotized, every ounce of self-preservation battling against the growing terror. I couldn't be the one to do this. I couldn't unleash something that might ruin countless lives just to save my own skin. Then I had an idea, a reckless, last-ditch plan that might let me slip out of their grasp, if only for a moment. I pulled out my phone and pretended to read a message, my heart hammering as I dialed 911, making sure the man across the street couldn't see. But I didn't speak, didn't even let the operator answer. I just kept the line open, hoping they'd trace it, hoping it'd alert someone, anyone, that something was wrong. After a few seconds, I accidentally dropped my phone, leaving it open on the ground, and backed away slowly, hoping that my open call would reach someone before the organization could intervene. It was a slim chance, but it was all I had. The man across the street narrowed his eyes. He'd noticed the phone. My heart sank as he started moving towards me, his expression darkening. I didn't wait to see what he'd do. I turned and walked quickly into the crowd, hoping to lose him in the throngs of people. As I moved, I kept looking over my shoulder, checking if he was still there, watching, but he was gone. Or maybe he was somewhere nearby, just waiting for the right moment to catch me again. Either way, I felt like I was in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, and I was out of moves. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I finally slipped into a small, nearly empty park. I found a secluded bench and slumped down, clutching the vial tightly, my mind racing. I didn't know how much time I had before they contacted me again, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed a real plan, something that would get me out of their clutches for good. That's when my phone buzzed with another message, making me jump. I didn't even have to look to know it was from Host Zero. Your delay has been noted. Final warning. My hand clenched around the vial, every muscle in my body tensing as I read the words. I was out of options, and I could feel them closing in. They wouldn't let me go, not without me doing what they wanted. I stared at the vial one last time, my reflection warped in the glass. And in that moment, I made a decision. I sat on that park bench, feeling the weight of the vial in my hand, cold and ominous. There was no way out, not really. They had me pinned, boxed into this horrific choice. Carry out their sick orders or face whatever twisted consequences they'd planned for people like me. Every option led to disaster. I'd be ruined one way or another. But if they'd chosen me because they thought I'd follow orders without question, they'd made a mistake. My mind was already racing with something new, an idea that was probably more reckless than anything I'd ever done. But if I was going to go down, I wasn't going to make it easy for them, and I wasn't going to go quietly. I took out my phone, careful to keep it close so nobody else could see what I was doing, and opened up my email app. My hands shook as I typed, words coming fast, trying to explain what I'd found, who these people were, and what they wanted me to do. I attached screenshots of the forum, the list of names, even the files from the USB drive, everything I could think of to make sure someone would see the truth. I addressed it to every news outlet I could think of, local and national, hitting send over and over, filling inboxes with my frantic warnings. As soon as the last email was sent, I took a deep breath. I didn't know if it would work, but at least someone would know. Even if they never found me, the story would be out there, waiting to be uncovered. I stood up, clutching the vial tightly, feeling the weight of it against my palm. I started walking, heading out of the park and down a path that led to the river. My plan was simple, but dangerous. Dump it in the water, somewhere out of sight, where no one would ever find it. Sure, it was a risk. If this stuff was as dangerous as they claimed, who knows what it would do? But the way I saw it, there was no safe option. I'd rather let it disappear here, out of reach, than put it into the hands of strangers in a crowded place. As I neared the edge of the river, my phone buzzed again. My heart skipped as I read the text. It was from Host 0. Unauthorized action detected. Surveillance has confirmed deviation. Prepare for intervention. My stomach twisted. They knew. Somehow, they'd been watching, tracking my every step. My hands started to shake as I glanced around, feeling exposed, as if a dozen eyes were watching from the shadows. A figure emerged at the edge of the path, blocking my route to the river. It was the man from earlier, the one who'd been watching me across the street. His face was expressionless, eyes cold and empty, and as he stepped toward me, I realized he wasn't here to talk. I backed up, clutching the vial tighter, my mind racing with panic. I could turn and run, try to lose him again, but I knew it was useless. They'd find me wherever I went. I felt cornered, like an animal trapped with no way out. Then, with sudden clarity, I realized I still had one last move, one thing that would make sure they couldn't use me, or the vial, ever again. My hand closed around the vial, gripping it so hard I could feel the glass biting into my skin. The man's eyes flicked to my hand, his expression hardening. "Don't do anything stupid," he said, his voice low, calculated. But he was too late. With a surge of defiance, I threw the vial against the ground with all my strength. It shattered instantly, yellowish liquid splattering across the dirt, seeping into the ground. A faint, sour odor filled the air, sharp and unnatural, but it was gone in seconds, sinking into the soil, destroyed. The man stopped dead, his face tightening to something almost like fear. For the first time, he looked shaken, out of control. I watched his eyes flicker with anger and something darker, like he'd seen this happen before and knew exactly what it meant for me. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said quietly, his voice laced with something between contempt and resignation. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me alone. But I knew this wasn't over. I could already feel it, a faint tingling in my hands. Maybe just paranoia, but maybe something else. Maybe the liquid had already seeped through the skin. Maybe I'd just exposed myself to whatever they'd been planning to spread. For the next few days, I stayed hidden, waiting to feel the effects, waiting to see if anyone would come for me, but no one did. There were no strange symptoms, no signs of illness, nothing but the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I swore I saw that same man in the distance, just standing there, watching. Every ring of my phone made me jump, convinced it was them, ready to reel me back in. Days turned into weeks, and then months. The texts stopped. The strange emails stopped. It was like I'd been erased, like they'd decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe I'd ruined their plans just enough to make them move on to someone else, some other poor soul who wouldn't fight back. But I know they're still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I still have nightmares about them, about the man's cold, expressionless face and the clinical, detached voice on the phone. I hear Host Zero's final message echoing in my mind, prepare for consequences, and every now and then I feel it, a faint tingling sensation in my fingers, like something lingering just beneath the surface, waiting. I was hired to record a paranormal event in the woods for the dark web. What I saw wasn't paranormal. So, yeah, this is probably the last time I'll ever take a gig off the dark web. And I know what you're thinking. What were you doing there in the first place? Fair question, honestly. I can't even come up with a solid reason, other than boredom and that weird fascination we all have with stuff that's just off. There's something thrilling about the forbidden corners of the internet, and I got hooked on that thrill way back in college. Weird part is, I was never even a risk taker, but I guess curiosity has a way of dulling your common sense. Anyway, I wasn't even looking for a job. I just liked browsing random forums, reading creepy requests, laughing it off, and moving on. But this one post caught my attention because it was just so specific. Looking for an experienced cameraman to record a paranormal event. Payment will be transferred through cryptocurrency. Must have an eye for detail and a calm temperament. Message for details. I don't know why I clicked on it. The word paranormal probably grabbed me, I guess. And if I'm being honest, the money offered was insane. Enough that it felt too good to pass up. I shoot and edit videos as a side gig, so I thought, hey, maybe it'll be like those ghost hunting shows. Some idiot with too much money probably just wanted to prank his friends or make a viral video. So I messaged the guy, and after a few back and forths, I ended up with a job. The details were vague, to put it nicely. He wouldn't tell me who he was, just went by some bizarre username and refused to show his face on camera. All he told me was that he needed proof of a certain phenomenon happening at a specific location, way out in the middle of nowhere. He emphasized that it needed to be unedited, raw footage. He also warned me to stay out of sight, for my own safety. Honestly, that should have been the first red flag. I asked him how I was supposed to get there, since it was a 6-hour drive from my place, and I don't even own a car. He just said, "Don't worry, a vehicle will be provided." That was weird. But a day later, a rental SUV arrived in my driveway with a full tank of gas, a map of the location, and a stack of cash in the glove compartment. No explanation, no note, nothing. Looking back, I know I should have stopped there. There were so many chances to back out, but I guess the money and curiosity got the better of me. Plus, everything felt so surreal, almost like I was in some kind of horror movie. I just wanted to see what was going to happen next. The location he gave me was deep in the woods, miles away from any town or even a gas station. I drove for hours with no cell signal, passing the occasional farmhouse or trailer, but it was mostly just open fields and dense patches of forest. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer. I thought, there's no way there's anything paranormal here. This place is dead, plain and simple. When I finally got to the spot, I noticed he'd been really specific about where to set up. It was a small clearing surrounded by massive trees, with thick moss blanketing the ground. There was a little hand-drawn map left in the SUV with a big X marking the clearing, almost like a treasure map. According to him, all I had to do was set up my camera on a tripod facing a certain direction and wait until the event occurs. Simple, right? Now, at this point, I was feeling more annoyed than scared. I figured I'd get some creepy animal sounds, maybe a raccoon or owl, or something I could pretend was supernatural, and call it a day. But after setting up, I realized how isolated I was. There was no sound, not even wind rustling through the trees. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Around 1 a.m., just as I was starting to feel drowsy, I heard a snap, like someone stepping on a twig. Instantly, I froze. I was supposed to be alone out here. I hadn't seen anyone or anything for miles, but this wasn't some animal noise. It was the deliberate, cautious step of a human. Then another step. I couldn't see anything. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness beyond the clearing. I flicked it off, hoping to stay hidden and keep my camera rolling, just like the guy told me. But then I remembered his message, stay out of sight. The footsteps continued, getting closer. Whoever it was didn't seem in any rush. They were taking their time, like they knew exactly where I was, but were just enjoying the suspense. My heart was pounding so loud, I was sure they could hear it, but I didn't dare move. Finally, through the dim glow of the moonlight, I saw something, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. They were tall, way taller than any person should be, and they were perfectly still, like they were watching me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be some kind of trick, or maybe a prop the guy set up for his paranormal event. But the longer I stared, the more unsettling it became. The figure stepped forward, and I swear my blood ran cold. It wasn't a mask, or some guy in a suit. Whatever this thing was, its limbs were too long, too thin, almost like they'd been stretched. Its face, or whatever you could call it, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin, where features should have been. I was rooted to the spot, torn between bolting and staying as still as possible. But then, in one smooth, unnatural motion, it tilted its head, as if curious, before slowly retreating back into the darkness of the trees. My hands were shaking as I looked down at the camera, half expecting it to be malfunctioning, but no, it had recorded everything. Part of me thought about just leaving right then, but I knew I'd never forgive myself for walking away without seeing this through. So, against every bit of common sense I had, I stayed. I don't know what I thought was going to happen, but deep down, I felt like that wasn't the last time I was going to see it. And as I sat there, staring at the edge of the trees, I felt a gnawing dread I couldn't shake. But things were only going to get worse. Much worse. I sat there in that dark clearing, gripping my flashlight so tight my fingers were numb. That thing, I still didn't know what to call it, had disappeared back into the woods, but every part of me felt like it was still there, lurking just out of sight, watching. I couldn't bring myself to move, though I knew I should have just packed up and left. The cash was good, sure, but not this good. But there was something about the way it looked at me, the tilt of its head. It had left me paralyzed, with a mix of horror and curiosity. It's hard to explain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was right on the edge of some twisted revelation. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it again, the crunch of leaves, that slow, deliberate pace, but this time it was moving away from me, deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I lifted the camera off the tripod and crept forward, keeping my flashlight off. The last thing I wanted was to alert it. Whatever it was, the moon was bright enough that I could make out the path it was taking, a narrow trail that looked barely used, with underbrush clawing at my legs as I followed. I kept a good distance, just close enough to catch a glimpse of it through the trees. The further I went, the more I felt like I was leaving reality behind. The air got colder, like I'd stepped into a fridge, and that eerie silence was back. No crickets, no wind, just dead air. And then it stopped. I was close enough now to see it clearly, its tall, misshapen silhouette standing at the center of a second clearing. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were 3 of them, all identical, with those stretched limbs and featureless faces, standing perfectly still. The way they were positioned looked almost ritualistic. They faced each other, forming a sort of triangle in the center of the clearing, each one just a few feet from the other. Their arms hung at unnatural angles, bent slightly backward, like the joints weren't quite in the right place. And then, as if they'd heard some silent command, they started to sway, moving in sync, a slow, rhythmic motion that made my skin crawl. It was like watching something ancient, something wrong that humans weren't supposed to see. I wanted to run, but something held me in place. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I was just too scared to turn my back on them. I kept the camera rolling, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, one of them stopped swaying and slowly turned its head. No, tilted its head toward me. I knew I hadn't made a sound, and I was hidden behind a tree, but it still looked directly at me, like it could sense me standing there. For a second, I thought it was going to move toward me, and every muscle in my body tensed, ready to bolt. But instead, it did something even worse. It lifted its arm and pointed, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down my spine. It was pointing at the other end of the clearing, where a narrow path disappeared into the woods. The message was clear, almost like it was inviting me, daring me to go further. I thought about turning back, getting to the SUV, and driving as far away from this place as possible. But something about that pointed arm felt personal, like if I didn't follow, there would be consequences. So, like an idiot, I did exactly what it wanted. I lowered the camera, took a deep breath, and stepped out from behind the tree. The other 2 figures didn't react at all, just kept swaying in that creepy rhythm. But the one that had pointed stayed perfectly still, watching me. Its head tilted just a little more as I passed it, as if approving. The path led deeper into the woods, winding through trees so thick they blocked out most of the moonlight. I don't know how long I walked. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. My senses were on high alert, every sound and shadow sending my nerves into overdrive. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting one of those things to be trailing me. But there was nothing, just that awful, suffocating silence. Finally, the path opened up into a third clearing, this one different from the others. In the center was a small, weathered cabin, barely visible in the dim light. It looked abandoned, with ivy climbing up the sides, and the windows dark, but the door was slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. A part of me wanted to turn around and run, but I felt drawn to it, like something was pulling me forward. As I stepped closer, I noticed faint symbols carved into the wood around the doorframe. They looked old, older than the cabin itself, and definitely not something that belonged there. Strange, jagged shapes that seemed to twist the longer I looked at them. I forced myself to glance away, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. Inside, it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels almost solid, pressing down on you. I flicked on my flashlight, and the beam cut through the dust-choked air, illuminating a small, cluttered room. There was a single table in the center, covered with an assortment of strange objects, bones, bits of old, decayed wood, and a cracked mirror that seemed to shimmer in a way that didn't match the light. The walls were covered in more of those symbols, carved directly into the wood, and then my flashlight caught something lying on the floor, a videotape, just a single, unlabeled VHS tape lying in the center of the room, as if someone had left it there for me. Against my better judgment, I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was dusty, worn, like it had been there for years, but something about it felt recent, like it was just waiting for someone to find it. As I stood there, holding the tape, I heard a soft rustling behind me, like fabric brushing against wood. I whipped around, my flashlight illuminating an empty corner of the room. But then I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, blocking my only way out. But this one was different. It looked like the others, with that stretched, unnatural frame, but it was dressed in old, ragged clothes, like it had tried to mimic a human appearance, but failed miserably. And this one had eyes, two hollow, sunken eyes, staring directly at me, unblinking. My body went numb with fear, my grip tightening around the tape as it took a slow, shuffling step forward, the floorboards creaking under its weight. I tried to back away, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. And then it opened its mouth, a wide, gaping hole that stretched too far, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Without thinking, I shoved the tape into my pocket and bolted, ducking under its outstretched arm and sprinting out of the cabin. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could hear was that horrible, ragged breathing behind me, close enough that I could feel it on the back of my neck. I ran down the path, branches scraping my arms and face, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that thing. By the time I reached the SUV, my chest was heaving, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and jammed the keys into the ignition. As I peeled out of there, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me, and that old, dust-covered tape sitting heavy in my pocket. It wasn't until I got home that I realized I was probably never meant to leave that place alive. By the time I made it back to my apartment, dawn was just starting to break. Everything felt hazy, like I'd been running from some half-remembered nightmare. The whole drive home, I kept expecting to see that figure pop up in my rearview mirror, but I never saw a thing. Still, the tension sat heavy in my gut, like something had followed me, something I couldn't shake. I didn't want to touch the tape, but it was there, weighing down my pocket. This physical reminder that everything I'd seen was real. I kept wondering, what could possibly be on that tape? Part of me was terrified to find out, but another part was drawn to it, like I didn't have a choice. It was the same sick curiosity that made me take the job in the first place. I sat at my desk, staring at the old VHS. The thing looked ancient, the plastic casing cracked and worn, but there was no label, no markings to tell me what I was in for. I don't even own a VHS player, so I ended up borrowing one from a neighbor who was confused, but too polite to ask questions. Back in my apartment, I hesitated, staring at the player with the tape clutched in my hands, my fingers shaking. I almost convinced myself to throw it out, to let whatever secrets it held die in the trash. But that was too easy, wasn't it? I had to know. When I finally slid the tape into the player and hit play, the TV screen flickered to life, showing nothing but static. I leaned forward, straining to hear anything, but it was just white noise. Then, after a few seconds, the screen went black. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence, my nerves so on edge that every little sound made me jump. And then the footage started. It was grainy, the kind of quality you'd expect from an old home movie. At first, it was just shots of a dark forest, panning slowly across tree trunks and dense undergrowth. I could see the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the branches, but everything else was pitch black. It was like the cameraman was trying to capture something just out of frame, something hidden in the shadows. Then the camera turned, and I realized with a sick jolt that I recognized the spot, the exact same clearing where I'd set up my equipment. There were no sounds, just that eerie silence, like even the animals knew to keep their distance. The camera zoomed in, focusing on the same spot where I'd seen those figures standing in a triangle. But this time, they weren't there. Instead, there was something else. At first, it just looked like a pile of rags or cloth lying in the center of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. But as the camera got closer, I could make out shapes within the heap, limbs, twisted and bent at impossible angles, poking out of the fabric. My stomach turned as I realized it was a body, or at least it used to be. Whoever it was, their arms and legs were contorted, almost deliberately posed, and their face, God, I still can't shake that image. It was frozen in a look of sheer terror, eyes wide open, mouth stretched in a silent scream. But the worst part, there were symbols carved into their skin, the same twisted shapes I'd seen on the walls of that cabin, etched deep into their flesh. The camera panned away from the body, turning toward the trees, and that's when I saw something moving in the background. It was subtle, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the frame, but it was there. The cameraman, if that's even what he was, seemed to catch it too, because the camera jerked suddenly, zooming in on a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was one of them, the same tall, distorted shape I'd seen, with its limbs stretched and face blank. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It just stood there, watching the body in the clearing, almost like it was admiring its handiwork. And then, just as the camera lingered on it, the figure slowly lifted its arm and pointed, just like it had pointed at me. But this time, it wasn't pointing at a path. It was pointing directly at the camera. The screen flickered again, and suddenly, the scene changed. Now, The camera was in motion, stumbling through the woods like whoever was holding it was running. The angle was shaky, darting back and forth between trees as branches snapped underfoot. Whoever was filming was panting, their breathing shallow and desperate. They kept glancing back over their shoulder as if something was chasing them, but I couldn't see anything, just the dark, empty woods stretching endlessly in every direction. Then, just as the camera whipped around, for what felt like the 100th time, it caught a glimpse of a figure standing right there in the middle of the path. It was closer now, its face, or whatever you'd call it, tilted in that same curious way, almost like it was amused. The person holding the camera let out a low, panicked gasp and turned, sprinting faster. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure was always just behind them, always watching. Eventually, the footage got too dark to see much, just the occasional flash of a tree trunk or a broken branch. The panting grew louder, more frantic, until finally, the cameraman stumbled, the camera crashing to the ground. For a moment, the screen went dark, and I thought the tape was over. But then, just as I was about to turn it off, the image returned, showing a single frame frozen on the screen. It was a face, but it wasn't the blank, featureless face of those things in the woods. This was a human face, twisted in horror, eyes wide and unseeing, staring directly into the camera. And I recognized it. It was me. The exact same expression I must have had when I was in that clearing, when I'd first seen those things. The screen cut to static, but the tape kept playing, hissing with white noise. I stared at it, feeling a creeping numbness settle over me, like I was outside my own body. I rewound the tape, played it again, hoping I'd imagined it. But there it was, the exact same face, frozen in terror, staring back at me. The tape ended abruptly after that, the screen going black. I sat there in silence, the TV humming quietly in the background. My mind was spinning, every nerve on edge, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. How was my face on that tape? I hadn't even gone into the woods until last night, and yet, somehow, I'd been there before, or something that looked exactly like me had. And then, as I sat there in the silence, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on my door. 3 slow, even knocks, like someone knew I was there and was just waiting. My heart stopped. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, just sat there, listening. Another set of knocks, louder this time, echoing through the room. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. The battery drained somehow, even though I charged it the night before. I was alone, no way to call for help, no idea who or what was on the other side of that door. For a while, everything was still. Just when I thought it might have gone away, the doorknob started to turn, slowly, as if whoever was outside was testing it, checking to see if it was locked. I felt every hair on my body stand on end, my skin cold with sweat. I didn't know what to do, didn't even know if I could do anything, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't human. The knob stopped turning, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was that same dead quiet from the woods, the kind that makes you feel like the world around you has gone dark, leaving you stranded in some empty, twisted version of reality. And then I heard it, a low, raspy voice, whispering through the door, so faint I could barely make it out. "We're not done yet." And with that, the knocking stopped. The doorknob stilled, and everything went quiet. But I didn't feel relieved. In fact, I felt like it was just beginning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment, clutching the baseball bat I'd pulled from the closet, staring at the door like it was going to burst open any second. I kept expecting to hear those knocks again, that slow twist of the doorknob, but nothing came. Hours crawled by, and eventually the sun started to rise, casting faint beams of light through the blinds. The daylight made everything feel almost normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the walls of my apartment, waiting. I kept glancing at the TV, half expecting the tape to start playing on its own. The thought made my stomach twist, but I couldn't bring myself to take it out of the player. It was like if I touched it again, I'd be inviting that thing back into my life, whatever it was. By afternoon, I was desperate for answers. I scoured every dark web forum, every thread, every shadowy corner of the internet, looking for anything remotely similar to what I'd experienced. I thought maybe I'd find some mention of the symbols on the cabin, or people talking about the tall, distorted figures I'd seen. But there was nothing, not a single reference, no story, no urban legends, just a deafening silence, like whatever I'd stumbled into wasn't supposed to be found. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed a private message in my inbox. It was from a username I didn't recognize, just a string of random letters and numbers. No profile picture, no bio, nothing. The message was short, almost cryptic. "Stop looking. You're only making it worse." My blood ran cold. I hadn't posted anything, hadn't reached out to anyone. I was working in total silence, alone in my apartment. But somehow, someone knew. I stared at the screen, every nerve on edge, waiting for another message. But nothing came. Just that one line, like a warning. I closed the laptop, feeling that creeping dread settle over me again, heavier this time. They, whoever they were, wanted me to stop. But something in me, maybe just sheer stubbornness, couldn't let it go. That night, I found myself pacing my apartment, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. Every now and then, I'd hear the faint creak of the floorboards, a whisper of movement outside my window. But when I looked, there was nothing. Finally, as midnight approached, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and headed back to the woods. I needed to see that clearing one more time. Needed to know if it was all just some sick joke, or if something had really been waiting for me out there. The drive felt longer this time, like the road itself was stretching, pulling me deeper into a place I shouldn't be. By the time I reached the trailhead, the moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the trees. I turned off the engine, the silence settling over me like a shroud. Part of me was terrified to go back, but that nagging curiosity was stronger. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold night air prickling against my skin. The path was almost unrecognizable in the dark, twisting and winding in ways I didn't remember. Shadows stretched across the ground, twisting and curling like they had a mind of their own. Every sound felt amplified, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sending a jolt through me. Eventually, I made it to the clearing, and there it was, just as I'd left it. The tripod I'd abandoned, toppled over and half buried in the moss, the faint indentations in the ground where I'd set up my camera. But this time, something was different. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, deep and distinct, leading from the spot where I'd seen those figures to a single hollowed-out tree at the edge of the clearing. I approached the tree slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The inside was pitch black, and as I shone the light inside, I realized it wasn't empty. There was something hanging from one of the branches, dangling just above eye level. My heart raced as I reached up, pulling it out of the shadows. It was a piece of cloth. No, a shirt. Torn, faded, and disturbingly familiar. My shirt, the one I'd worn the night I first came here. There was no way it could have been here. I hadn't left anything behind. But as I held it in my hands, I noticed something else. Stitched into the fabric in crude, jagged letters was a message. "We're not done yet." I staggered back, dropping the shirt, my mind spinning. It was like they'd known I was coming back, like they'd left it there just for me. I turned, ready to bolt, but before I could take a step, I felt it. The same icy sensation I'd felt in my apartment, that prickling sense of being watched. I raised my flashlight, sweeping it across the clearing, and then I saw them. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely illuminated by the beam. There were more of them this time, maybe 5 or 6, each one identical, with those long, twisted limbs and featureless faces. They stood perfectly still, like statues, but I could feel their eyes, or whatever they had in place of eyes, boring into me. Slowly, they started to move, each one lifting a long, crooked arm, pointing. But this time, they weren't pointing at the path or at the camera. They were pointing at me. I took a step back, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. I felt like a deer in headlights, paralyzed, unable to look away. And then, as one, they began to sway, that same rhythmic motion I'd seen on the tape, their bodies bending and twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The longer I watched, the more my vision blurred, the world around me spinning like I was caught in some awful trance. And then, I heard a voice, not a whisper, not something outside of me, but in my head, cold, emotionless, like a blade pressing against my thoughts. "You're part of this now." The words sent a chill through my spine, each one echoing in my mind like a drumbeat. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot, helpless as they drew closer, their arms still outstretched, fingers curling toward me. Just when I thought they were going to reach me, they stopped, the sway of their bodies slowing, their heads tilting in that same curious way. And then one by one, they began to step back, melting into the darkness until the clearing was empty. I was alone again, my heart pounding, my breaths shallow and ragged, but I knew, deep down, that they hadn't left. They were still watching, still waiting. I ran, stumbling over roots and branches, barely able to see through the tears in my eyes. When I reached the SUV, I didn't even look back. I just started the engine and tore down the road, not caring if I crashed, as long as I put as much distance as possible between me and that clearing. But when I got home, I realized I hadn't escaped. Not really, because when I walked into my apartment, the tape was gone. The VHS player was sitting there, empty, as if it had never been touched. And then I heard it, the faint, deliberate knock on my door. 3 slow, even knocks, just like the night before. But this time, I knew. They weren't going to leave. I don't know what's coming next, but whatever it is, I can feel it getting closer. The knock started up again, louder and more insistent this time, echoing through the walls of my empty apartment. 3 slow, heavy knocks, each one shaking me to my core. I stood in the middle of my living room, staring at the door, paralyzed by fear. I knew they were waiting, just outside, and I had no idea what would happen if I opened that door. But then the knocking stopped, and everything fell silent. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that they were gone. But then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Movement. Faint, but unmistakable. I turned, my heart hammering, and saw a shadow shifting against the far wall. It stretched up, tall and distorted, limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles, like the figures I'd seen in the clearing. Slowly, the shadow moved, creeping along the wall, its head tilting in that familiar, unsettling way. I backed away, the floorboards creaking under my feet, but the shadow kept coming, growing darker and more defined. And then, without warning, it pulled itself from the wall, stepping forward like it was peeling itself out of another dimension. Standing there, in the middle of my apartment, was one of them. Its skin was pale and smooth, its face blank and featureless, except for two hollow, sunken sockets where eyes should have been. It stared at me, or maybe it sensed me somehow, tilting its head with an almost curious grace. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was trapped. The thing raised one of its long, crooked arms, and I felt the air around me grow thick, like I was sinking underwater. I struggled to move, to break free, but it was like my body was no longer my own. My limbs felt heavy, leaden, as if they were being forced down. And then, in the corner of my vision, I saw something else. The television flickered to life, static buzzing across the screen, and then I saw it, the clearing, the exact spot I'd been the night this all started. But now, there was something new, something I couldn't look away from. In the center of the clearing was a figure slumped against a tree, its clothes torn and dirty, its head hanging low. The camera zoomed in, and as it got closer, my stomach twisted. The figure was me. It was like staring into some twisted mirror, watching myself trapped and lifeless, held in that clearing like a marionette. My clothes were ripped and stained, and my face, God, my face was frozen in that same look of terror I'd seen on the tape before. But it wasn't just fear. It was something worse, something primal and empty, like all the life had been drained out of me. I tried to tear my eyes away from the screen, but the figure standing in my apartment had me rooted in place. It started to sway, that same hypnotic, rhythmic motion, its body bending in ways that defied logic. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me into that darkness, its hollow gaze locked on me. And then the voice came again, inside my head, cold and empty, filling me with a dread so deep I felt like I was drowning in it. It's your turn. The words settled over me, final and absolute, like a death sentence. I didn't know what they meant, but I could feel it in my bones. Whatever they were, whatever this was, it was pulling me into something I couldn't escape. I watched, helpless, as the figure on the TV screen began to move, its head lifting, eyes blank and staring, like it was coming to life. The thing in my apartment took a step closer, reaching out with those long, twisted fingers. I felt something cold brush against my face, and in that moment, it was like a door inside me opened, a door I never knew existed. Memories, or maybe visions, flashed before my eyes. I saw the clearing, the cabin, the symbols carved into the walls, all twisted together in a whirlwind of terror. I saw people I didn't recognize, their faces twisted in horror, each one frozen in that awful expression I'd seen on the tape. And then I saw myself, standing alone in the clearing, my eyes wide and unseeing, my mouth open in a silent scream. It was like I was looking at my own death, over and over, trapped in an endless loop of horror. My body moved without my control, my legs carrying me forward, closer to the screen. The figure on the TV was watching me now, its hollow eyes reflecting mine, and I felt a strange sense of familiarity, like this had all happened before. I was walking toward the screen, drawn by an invisible force, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was that figure stepping out of the shadows, reaching out for me, pulling me into the darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the woods. The clearing stretched out before me, silent and empty, the moon casting long shadows across the ground. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see them twisted and distorted, but they looked normal. I took a step forward, the crunch of leaves underfoot sounding too loud in the silence, and then, from the shadows, they emerged. All of them, those tall, distorted figures surrounding the clearing, their eyes locked on me. I could feel their presence, cold and unyielding, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, rooted to the spot as they closed in, forming a circle around me. The lead figure stepped forward, its head tilting in that familiar way, and I understood, finally, what it wanted. It wanted me to join them. Slowly, my limbs started to move, twisting and stretching, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I felt my mouth open, a silent scream tearing through my mind, but no sound came out. My body was no longer mine. It was theirs, part of their twisted ritual, part of whatever they were. As my vision blurred, I saw a flash of movement in the distance, a camera lens, hidden in the darkness, recording everything. I knew then that this was the last image anyone would ever see of me. Frozen in that clearing, my body contorted, my face locked in that same look of terror. The camera clicked off, the darkness swallowing me whole, and as my vision faded, I understood what the voice had meant. It was my turn. I found a dark web link that claims to reveal the truth about a secret space program. Now I'm seeing black SUVs outside my house. Alright, I know this sounds absolutely insane, and trust me, I wouldn't have believed it either if someone had told me. But here I am, typing this up in the dark, constantly glancing out my window, praying that I'm just being paranoid. Maybe writing it down will help me figure out what's happening, or at the very least, keep me sane. I've always been one of those people who can't resist the weird side of the internet. Like, some people dive into TikTok rabbit holes. I go straight for the deep web. I'd been messing around on those anonymous forums for a while, just out of curiosity. It's usually just the same old conspiracy theories, weird vintage sites, and dead forums. But one night, about a week ago, I found something different. It started pretty normally. I was scrolling through an old forum on a site where people supposedly share classified government documents. 99% of the time, these are just grainy, blurry photos of nonsense. But that night, someone had posted a link, buried deep in the comments section of a forum, titled, "The Black Truth." The post was cryptic, just a short sentence in bold letters. You don't have to look up. The truth has been hidden in plain sight. Click here if you're ready to understand. I know. Clicking unknown links on the deep web is the digital equivalent of jumping off a cliff for no reason. But this, it just hooked me. I told myself I'd just click and see, then close the tab if it looked sketchy. Famous last words, right? I clicked. The page loaded surprisingly fast, which was weird in itself. Most deep web stuff takes forever to load. The background was plain black, and there was only one video file on the screen with the title, Project Nebula. Underneath it said, "Confidential, viewers risk." At that point, I was kind of rolling my eyes. Another random conspiracy video, right? I hovered over the play button, my fingers itching with hesitation. Part of me wanted to just back out, but something about it was pulling me in, like I had to watch it. So I hit play. The video started with a grainy, pixelated shot of what looked like a government lab. Rows of computers, each one flashing with charts and numbers in real time. The camera panned across the room slowly, almost like whoever was filming wanted to show every detail. There was no sound, but you could tell this wasn't some amateur setup. The equipment was top of the line. NASA-grade stuff, if I had to guess. And then the camera zoomed in on a screen displaying what looked like a map of the solar system. But something was off. There were extra points of light around Earth, close enough that they had to be artificial satellites, or something else. They were arranged in an orbit that didn't look natural, all in perfect alignment, forming some kind of grid around the planet. After a few seconds, the video cut to a close-up of a document labeled Project Nebula Overview. I strained my eyes, trying to read the small print. The words were a mix of scientific jargon and classified information, but what I could make out sounded insane. Something about planetary defense and non-terrestrial threats. There was a mention of the truth about Apollo 18, which made my skin crawl. Everyone knows NASA only went up to Apollo 17, right? And then, right at the bottom of the document, there was a line that sent a chill down my spine. Unauthorized disclosure will result in termination of the subject. Before I could process what I just read, the video cut to black, and a new message popped up on the screen. You have seen enough. Close this window now. Now, I was seriously freaked out. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding like crazy. I sat there in silence, trying to calm down, but I couldn't shake this feeling like something was seriously, terribly wrong. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was probably just some well-made prank video. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget what I'd seen. After a few minutes, I convinced myself to go back to my laptop and close the tab properly, just in case. But when I opened the screen, the video was gone. I refreshed, reopened the forum, but it was like it had never existed. The forum thread itself was still there, but the original post, the one with the link, had vanished. I even tried digging through my history, but there was no trace of it. And then, just as I was about to give up, I got an email notification. It was from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of random numbers and letters. The subject line read, "You were warned." I didn't open it. Instead, I shut down my laptop, shoved it in a drawer, and went to bed, trying to pretend like none of this had happened. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of that map. All those lights orbiting around us, perfectly spaced, like they were watching or guarding something. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I'd imagined it all. But then, when I stepped outside to grab my mail, I saw it. A black SUV parked just down the street from my house. The SUV didn't move. It was just sitting there, engine running quietly, tinted windows hiding anyone inside. It looked normal enough if you weren't paying attention. Maybe just some neighbor's friend, or a delivery van. But I knew every car that parked on our street, and this one wasn't from around here. I tried to act casual, just strolling over to my mailbox. I grabbed the mail and lingered, stealing glances at the SUV out of the corner of my eye. No movement. It felt like someone was watching me, though. You know that feeling when you're alone, but something in the air shifts. It's hard to explain, but my instincts were on high alert, telling me to get inside. I ignored them and made myself walk slowly back to the door, even though every fiber of my being wanted to run. That night, I couldn't get it out of my head. I sat in the dark, watching through my front window, half expecting the SUV to reappear. I thought about the video, the weird documents, the planets encircled by lights, like some kind of interplanetary defense system. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there were probably a million explanations for why that car had been there. Then, around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from another random number, a long one, almost like it was from an international line. The message was short, just 3 words. "Close your curtains." A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around, feeling exposed. My curtains were already closed, but now I felt as if every wall, every window was transparent. I typed back, fingers shaking, asking, "Who is this?" but got no reply. I checked the message details, but there was no info, no name, just the number. I tried to sleep after that, but every creak, every groan of the house felt louder, more intense. I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for another message, but nothing came, just silence. Somehow, that was worse than getting a follow-up. I'd almost rather know what they wanted. I finally drifted off around 3 a.m., only to be jolted awake by the faint hum of a car engine outside. I crept over to the window, barely lifting the edge of the curtain to peek outside. The black SUV was there again, this time parked directly in front of my house, facing the driveway. I couldn't see anyone inside, but the engine was running. I stayed there, frozen, watching for what felt like hours, until eventually the car just rolled away into the night, leaving me staring at an empty street. The next morning, I went outside, almost expecting some kind of sign that the car had been there, like tire marks or something. Nothing, just the same empty street, the same quiet neighborhood. My head was buzzing with questions, but there was nobody I could ask about it. Who would even believe me? I tried to go about my day, trying to shake off the paranoia that was slowly settling in. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning for any black cars, any unfamiliar faces. Every time I saw a black SUV, even if it was a completely different model, my heart would race, and I'd feel this jolt of fear. It was like a nightmare following me into the daylight, making me jump at every shadow. Around lunchtime, I got a call from a no-caller ID number. Now, usually, I ignore those, assuming it's some scam or telemarketer. But this time, I couldn't help myself. I answered, holding my breath as I pressed the phone to my ear. For a few seconds, there was silence. And then, I heard this faint, static-filled whisper on the other end, like someone was talking just out of range. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice, low and deliberate. I said, "Hello, who is this?" But there was no reply, just that soft, eerie whispering that I could barely hear. Finally, the voice got clearer, like the person on the other end had adjusted the volume. And then I heard it, just 2 words. "Stop searching." My skin crawled. I tried to respond, my mouth dry, but the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. Who was this? How did they get my number? And how did they know I'd been digging around online? I was starting to wonder if this was some elaborate prank, but the fear felt real. Too real. I could feel my body reacting, muscles tense, heart racing, like I was in actual danger. And yet, part of me still wanted to know more. Call it curiosity, call it stupidity, but I couldn't just let this go. That night, I stayed up late, combing through forums again, trying to find any mention of Project Nebula or the video I'd seen. But it was like the entire thing had been erased from the internet. I couldn't find a single mention of the non-terrestrial threats I'd seen, not even a trace of the original post that had led me down this rabbit hole in the first place. It was all just gone. By 2 a.m., I'd just about given up when I heard it again, the hum of a car engine. I turned off all my lights and peered out the window. The same black SUV was back, but this time, 2 more had joined it, parked in a line along the street. They sat there in silence, engines idling, like they were waiting for something or someone. The 3 SUVs didn't move. They were just lined up along the street, headlights off, engines humming in the dead of night. I sat there, staring, not daring to breathe. It felt like some weird standoff, me hiding in the shadows of my own living room, and those vehicles just waiting. I thought about calling the cops, but what was I even supposed to say? Hello, I think some government agents are parked outside my house because I clicked a weird link on the deep web. Yeah, that wouldn't go over well. Instead, I decided to stay quiet, to watch them like they were watching me. As I sat there in the dark, I felt something cold slither down my spine, a presence, like someone else was in the room with me. I whipped my head around, half expecting to see a figure standing behind me. Nothing, just the quiet, darkened corners of my house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned back to the window, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in my driveway. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. A shadowy figure, tall and motionless, stood right by my mailbox, just barely visible in the glow of the distant streetlight. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any details, but their face was hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. They were just staring in my direction. I ducked down instinctively, pressing myself against the wall next to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Who were they? One of the drivers? Someone monitoring me? I didn't know what to think, and a part of me didn't want to know. Minutes ticked by in silence, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't resist anymore. I inched back up to the window, moving slowly, carefully, just enough to get another look. But the figure was gone. The SUVs were still there, though, engines still rumbling softly in the night. My nerves were fried. I felt like a caged animal, trapped in my own home. I grabbed my phone, desperate to distract myself, to do anything other than think about what I'd seen. That's when I noticed a new email in my inbox. No subject line, no sender name, just a plain text email that hadn't been there an hour ago. My hands trembled as I opened it. The message was short. This is your final warning. Stop investigating. Delete everything. Attached to the email was a single image file. I hesitated, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on it, and a blurry, grainy photo filled my screen. It was of my house, taken from the street at night, like someone had snapped it from the driver's seat of a car. In the photo, you could see my silhouette in the window, watching the SUVs just moments earlier. The timestamp was from 10 minutes ago. I felt a rush of cold sweat break out across my forehead. Someone had taken this photo of me, right here, in my own home, just minutes ago. My throat went dry. They were watching, closer than I'd thought. I did what any sane person would do. I deleted the email, the photo, everything. But I knew it wasn't that easy. My stomach was in knots as I stared down at my phone, half expecting another message. This was no prank, no joke. Someone was seriously messing with me, and they wanted me to stop digging. They'd seen me. They'd been outside my house, and I didn't even know who they were or what they wanted. Just that I'd apparently seen enough. Sleep was out of the question after that. I sat in the corner of my living room, out of view of any windows, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I was thinking of calling a friend, anyone, just to let them know what was going on. But who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, and I was the one living it. The hours dragged on, and finally, as dawn started to break, I managed to sneak another glance outside. The SUVs were gone. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that they weren't there. Dread that they might come back. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was just some elaborate prank or a case of mistaken identity. Maybe those SUVs were just ordinary cars, and the figure in my driveway was just some night walker passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to know. Later that day, I made the mistake of opening my laptop again. I hadn't touched it since the first email, but something inside me needed to know if anything else had been erased or left behind. When I booted it up, the screen was glitchy, like static lines running across the display. I figured it was just a malfunction until a message popped up on the screen in plain white text. "We warned you. Last chance." I stared at the words, feeling a surge of defiance. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or maybe it was just that stubborn part of me that hated being told what to do. Either way, I wasn't going to let some faceless threat scare me off. That night, just as I was about to call it quits, my laptop screen flickered and a new file appeared on my desktop. It was titled "SeeThem.move." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. Part of me knew this was a trap, that whatever I was about to see would only dig me deeper into whatever hole I'd stumbled into. But I clicked. The video started with another grainy scene, similar to the first, but this time it was outside. The camera was aimed at the night sky, scanning slowly across a field of stars. At first, nothing seemed out of place, just an empty sky. But as the camera zoomed in, I began to notice small points of light moving, almost like tiny stars shifting in patterns across the sky. Then, one by one, they started to disappear, fading out until the night sky was empty again, just darkness. And then, the screen cut to a close-up of another document, this time even harder to read, but I could make out a single line that filled me with dread. "The watchers are closer than you think." The video cut to black, and my laptop shut off. No matter how many times I tried, it wouldn't turn back on. I was left in silence, the words echoing in my mind. "The watchers are closer than you think." The last thing I wanted to do was look out my window, but some instinct forced me to check. I slid over to the edge of the window, barely lifting the curtain. The black SUVs were back, but this time they weren't parked on the street. They were in my driveway, headlights off, doors open. The SUVs sat there in my driveway, black as shadows, with all four doors open like they were inviting me, or waiting for me. No lights, no sound, just those open doors, gaping into the darkness. I felt frozen, like some invisible force was holding me in place. Every instinct screamed at me to hide, but my curiosity had dragged me this far, and now it wouldn't let go. I could barely see anything beyond the doors. It was just pitch black inside, like whatever was in there swallowed all the light around it. I stayed hidden by the edge of the window, heart pounding so loud it felt like it was echoing through the silent house. I kept telling myself it was just a car, just some empty vehicle. But then I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the first SUV, then another from the second, then a third, until 4 figures in total were standing in my driveway, all dressed identically in black suits, their faces hidden by shadow. They didn't move, didn't talk, just stood there, lined up like statues, facing my house. My breath hitched. I could barely see them, but I knew they could see me. I felt their gaze even through the walls. For a long, agonizing minute, none of us moved. And then, as if on cue, the 4 figures began walking in perfect unison up my driveway, closer to my front door. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I thought about calling the cops, grabbing something for self-defense, anything to break this nightmare. But deep down, I knew it was too late. These people, whoever they were, had been watching me for days. If they wanted to get into my house, they'd find a way. I heard the faint sound of footsteps on my porch. They were here. I held my breath, straining to hear any hint of what they were doing. There was no knock, no attempt to enter, just silence. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, a voice, low, almost mechanical, as if coming from some distorted speaker. I could barely make out the words, but it sounded like one of them was talking directly into a device. The subject is uncooperative. Initiate protocol. Protocol. My mind raced with questions I didn't want the answers to. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room for any escape route. Then, from somewhere near the front door, I heard a subtle hiss, like air escaping from a pressurized tank. A thin, nearly invisible mist started creeping under the doorframe, slowly filling the room with this strange, sterile smell, like hospital antiseptic, but sharper, almost metallic. I clamped my hand over my mouth, backing away. The air was thickening. Every breath felt heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. My head started to spin, and my vision blurred around the edges. I stumbled, tripping over the edge of my coffee table, crashing to the floor. My limbs felt sluggish, like I was moving underwater. I tried to crawl, to get as far away from the door as I could, but my body wasn't responding. And then, just before I blacked out, I saw the shadow of a figure standing over me. I woke up to the hum of an engine. My head throbbed, every inch of my body aching as if I had been hit by a truck. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and realized I was sitting in the back of one of the black SUVs. My hands were bound with zip ties, and I could feel the cool bite of metal against my wrists. Outside, it was still dark. I had no idea where we were, but we were moving fast, the road a blur of shadowy trees and flickering streetlights. The driver was silent, just a dark shape in the front seat. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel the weight of their presence, heavy and oppressive. I tried to move, to twist my hands free, but the restraints held tight. Panic clawed at my chest. I thought about yelling, banging on the windows, anything to get someone's attention, but the roads were empty, desolate. I might as well have been screaming into a void. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the SUV slowed down, pulling off onto a narrow, unmarked road surrounded by dense trees. The headlights illuminated a chain-link gate with a no trespassing sign hanging from it. Without a word, the driver rolled down their window, entered a code into a keypad by the gate, and it swung open. The SUV drove through, and as the gate closed behind us, I felt a cold dread settle in. I'd heard stories about places like this, off-the-grid facilities where people disappear, where questions are never answered. My mind flashed back to the video, the warnings, the watchers. This was it. They'd taken me, and I had no idea if I was ever coming back. The SUV pulled up in front of a plain, windowless building, all concrete and metal, with a single door and a keypad next to it. The driver got out, and a second figure opened my door, pulling me out of the SUV. I was too weak to resist, my body still sluggish from whatever they'd used on me. They led me inside, down a series of narrow, dimly lit hallways. The walls were bare, sterile, giving nothing away. I stumbled as they pushed me forward, my footsteps echoing against the cold floors. Finally, we stopped in front of a door with a small, foggy window. They opened it, shoved me inside, and shut the door behind me with a heavy clang. The room was empty, save for a metal chair in the center and a dim, flickering bulb overhead. I stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed. Then, I heard footsteps outside, followed by the door opening. A figure stepped in, tall, wearing a crisp black suit and dark glasses. He had this cold, expressionless face, like he'd done this 1,000 times before, and it meant nothing to him. He sat down in the chair across from me, folding his hands neatly on his lap. For a long moment, we just stared at each other in silence. Then, he spoke, his voice low and calm, with a hint of something that sent a shiver through me. "You were told to stop." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every word felt stuck in my throat, my brain still reeling from whatever drug they'd pumped into the room. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing through me. "You've seen things you shouldn't have. There are consequences for curiosity." I finally managed to find my voice, though it came out barely a whisper. I didn't do anything. I was just looking." He tilted his head, almost like he was amused. "Looking is enough. Project NEBULA exists for a reason, and those reasons are not for the public to know." My heart pounded. This wasn't just some empty threat. He meant every word. I tried to swallow, my mouth dry. What is Nebula? What are the Watchers?" He leaned back, a slight smirk on his face. "You're asking the wrong questions." Then his expression darkened. "The only question you should be asking is whether you'll leave here with your memory, or at all." I felt my stomach drop, a sickening realization settling over me. They had no intention of letting me go, not unless I forgot everything I'd seen, everything I'd uncovered. I couldn't tell if I was trembling from fear or adrenaline, but somehow I managed to speak. "Then why bring me here? Why not just make me disappear?" The man's smirk returned. "Because sometimes people like you serve a purpose. Your kind keeps the public looking in the wrong direction, makes our job easier." He stood up, straightening his suit. "You will be returned home. But remember this, if you look again, if you so much as think about Project Nebula, we'll make sure you disappear, permanently." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the empty room, my mind racing with fear and a twisted sense of relief. I don't remember how I got back home. One moment, I was alone in that cold, sterile room. replaying the man's words over and over, feeling a mixture of fear and dread. The next, I woke up in my own bed, the early morning sun creeping through the blinds, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen like it was just another normal day. For a split second, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare, that I'd imagined the entire thing. But as I sat up, I noticed the faint bruises around my wrists where the zip ties had been, and a thin, scabbed-over scratch on my arm that I didn't remember getting. My body felt heavy, exhausted, like I'd been dropped back into it after being gone for hours. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to shake the lingering fog from my head. In the mirror, I saw my own eyes staring back, bloodshot and haunted. I'd seen things I wasn't supposed to see, things that normal people weren't supposed to even know existed. And now I was back, with no idea why they'd let me go, or what they expected me to do with what I knew. But here's the worst part, the part that keeps me up every night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'm losing my mind. They didn't take my memory. I remember everything, every detail, every shadow, every word. They left me with it all, like they wanted me to live with it, to carry this knowledge, like a curse. The first few days after that, I tried to act normal, to go about my life like nothing had happened, but everything felt wrong. Every black SUV I saw made my heart race. Every unknown number calling my phone sent a spike of fear through me. I was jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. Even my friends started to notice, asking if I was all right. I wanted to tell them to unload this nightmare, but I couldn't. I knew what would happen if I did. Then, last night, something happened that pushed me over the edge. I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, when I heard it, the faint hum of a car engine outside. My body went rigid, and that old, familiar dread flooded back. I crept to the window, lifting the curtain just an inch, heart pounding. It was there, another black SUV, idling silently across the street. But this time, something was different. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. They stood there, looking directly at my house, directly at me, as if they knew I'd be watching. The figure was tall, dressed in the same dark suit, but their face, it was blank, almost as if it were featureless. The shadows swallowed any detail, making them look like a living silhouette. I froze, unable to look away. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised a hand and pointed right at me. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, breathing hard. I didn't know what to do, my mind a blur of panic and fear. When I dared to look out the window again, the figure was gone. The street was empty, silent, as if nothing had ever been there. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just a flashback, some leftover terror from whatever they drugged me with. But then, around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint tapping at my front door, just 3 slow, steady knocks. I lay there in bed, paralyzed, gripping the sheets, waiting. The knocking stopped, but I didn't dare move. I stayed awake all night, too terrified to even look. This morning, I finally worked up the courage to check. I opened my door, half expecting to find some kind of note or message. There was nothing, just the quiet morning air. But on the doorstep, faint but unmistakable, were muddy footprints, leading away from my door down the path and disappearing onto the street. It's been a few hours since then, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that they're watching me, that this was their way of reminding me they could come back anytime they wanted, They left me here, with all these memories, these pieces of something I'll never fully understand, like some kind of warning. I don't know if they're testing me or waiting to see if I'll crack, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget what I saw. So now, here I am, writing this all down, even though I know it's probably dangerous. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe they'll come for me again if they find out. But I have to get it out of my head to let someone else know that they're out there, watching us, controlling things we can't even begin to understand. And if you ever come across a link to something called Project Nebula on the deep web, close it. Forget you ever saw it, because once you see them, they never really leave you. And if you hear a car engine idling outside your house at 3 a.m., don't look.